Japan against Korea, Korea against Japan, Japan against China, China against Japan, Korea versus China, China versus Korea, and meanwhile, North Korea and Taiwan are stuck in the middle. Dear friends, East Asia has become, if it hasn't always been, a hotbed of confrontation and diplomatic crisis between the three most powerful neighbors in the region, China, Japan, and South Korea. Conflicts that sometimes, to the Western eye, may seem ridiculous, but in East Asia are much more than simple territorial conflicts of who owns which tiny island. Islands that, in some cases, as we will see a little later on, are not much more than lumps of rock. The problem, if we can call it that, is that in this part of the world, along with the territorial issue, there is a component of honor, nationalism, and a feeling of a need for self-defense that has a lot to do with the dark events of the 20th century, events that occurred less than 80 years ago. During the first half of the 20th century, Japan carried out an aggressive campaign to expand its empire in East Asia and also in Southeast Asia, which began in 1904 with the Russo-Japanese War and ended with the capitulation of the Japanese Empire in 1945. That imperial expansion cost tens of millions of lives, including those of millions of civilians who lost their lives in numerous massacres, indiscriminate attacks, executions, human experiments, and a host of other atrocities that were later recognized as war crimes. This expansionist campaign involved the occupation of numerous countries. Although the signing of the 1951 Treaty of San Francisco regulated the return of all the territories of the former colonies to their respective nations after the fall of the Japanese Empire, certain legal loopholes and ambiguities have led Japan to still claim some of them as its own. This is why some of the victims of the Japanese Empire pull out their claws every time Japan says that this or that territory is theirs. Of course, this is not the only reason. You need to factor in the growing influence of China and the fierce struggle for every square meter of the exclusive economic zones that has also fueled many of these political confrontations. The most notorious cases are the Senkaku Islands, which Japan disputes with both China and Taiwan, the Dokdo Islands of South Korea, and with considerably less media noise, the southern parts of the Russian Kuril Islands, as well as the southern atoll Okinotorishima. This place, Okinotorishima, is a place that you've probably never heard of, but it has a curious history behind it. Friends, in this video, we're going to tell you exactly what's behind all these territorial conflicts which, in some cases, have made the waters that separate Japan from China, South Korea, and Russia a hot spot, hotter than a hot pot. Listen up, because there is so much more ground to cover in this story than we could ever imagine at first glance. So, let's get into it.
Senkaku, the manufactured conflict.
Friends, have you ever heard of the Senkaku Islands? Or maybe you're more familiar with their Chinese name, Diaoyu, and I know that I probably pronounced that incorrectly. To those of you watching this video from the West, which will be the majority, it is likely that you will have not heard of them either. However, in East Asia, things are very, very different. The Senkaku Islands are a group of 5 islands and 3 completely uninhabited rocks that lie between Japan, Taiwan, and mainland China. The closest island to the 3 countries is in a strategic position, 170 kilometers from Taiwan, 170 kilometers from the Japanese island of Ishigaki, and 330 kilometers from the coast of mainland China. Like so many other islands in the area, Japan recognized them as its own territory in 1895, just before beginning its military expansion, when Japan's strategy was to reclaim uninhabited territory in any relatively nearby islands. The Senkaku group of islands never had more than 200 inhabitants, mainly fishermen, who took advantage of the rich fishing grounds in the surrounding area. Anyway, the curious thing about this story is not so much how the Japanese claimed their sovereignty over this territory, but what they did afterwards. The Empire of Japan privatized the Senkaku Islands in 1932, when it sold them to the Koga family, who intended to establish a food production center there. In 1940, however, their project collapsed, and after the Japanese defeat in 1945, the islands came under the administration of the United States, which also administered all of Japan until 1952. These islands, however, remained under US control for 2 more decades, right up until 1972. In that year, not only were the Senkaku returned to Japanese sovereignty, but 4 of the islands were also bought by a different family, the Kurihara family. And friends, that's exactly when this whole mess started. With the return of the islands by the United States to Japan, China and Taiwan simultaneously began to claim them as their own, based on their proximity and a historical dispute over maritime delimitation. Actually, using their arguments, the islands would belong to Taiwan, but of course, since communist China does not recognize Taiwan as a country, they've claimed them as their own. But at the end of the day, we are talking about uninhabited islands without much apparent interest, so the diplomatic and territorial conflicts fell dormant over the years, without causing major problems. That is until 2012, when it suddenly stirred again.
As I've said many times before, although the United States does not take a position on the ultimate sovereignty of the islands, we acknowledge they are under the administration of Japan.
Clinton's comments have angered China's leadership. Mr. Lei said her statements, quote, confused right with wrong.
So, what do you think could have happened in 2012 to reignite the Senkaku problem? Well, Japan decided to nationalize the islands. Yes, nationalize them. It bought the islands back from the Kurihara family and made the protection of the archipelago a national priority, even expanding the military units deployed around them. This prompted China to send a maritime surveillance aircraft to fly over the island's airspace for the first time since 1958. Not only that, Chinese raids and Japanese responses with similar acts have been constant ever since. And in fact, we're reaching a peak at the time of making this video, with Chinese Coast Guard ships regularly patrolling these islands. Now, what has led China to expand its pressure and vigilance over the Senkaku group? Well, surprisingly, it boils down to this.
Vote in Japan to change status of disputed islands threatens to raise tensions with China. The Ishigaki City Council in Japan's Okinawa Prefecture approved the legislation that changes the administrative status of the uninhabited island group, known as the Senkakus in Japan and the Diaoyus in China. The bill changes the name of the islands for administrative purposes from Tonoshiro to Tonoshiru Senkaku. CNN.
A name change. Although it seems hard to believe, a simple change of name by a city council was enough to unleash a diplomatic skirmish.
Diaoyu Island and the affiliated islands are China's inherent territory. China is resolute in safeguarding our territorial sovereignty. This so-called administrative redesignation is a serious provocation towards China's territorial sovereignty. Zhao Lijian, a spokesperson for China's foreign ministry.
Don't tell me it doesn't seem like a joke, but the reality is stranger. This is how things work in East Asia. The fact is that legally, with the law in hand, there is no doubt that the Senkaku Islands are currently Japanese territory, and the claims of Taiwan and China do not seem to have much of a bearing. Of course, with Xi Jinping at the helm of China, you never know. However, as we mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is by no means the only territorial conflict Japan has opened. The other major conflict is that of the Dokdo Islands, which directly involves South Korea. And let's just say that these two countries get along like cats and dogs. Listen up.
It's not the islands, it's our honor.
In the East Sea, between the Korean peninsula and Japan, there is Dokdo, just 2 islets, and a handful of rocks that have nevertheless become one of the most characteristic patriotic symbols of South Korea. But how on earth could 2 pieces of rock in the middle of the sea, where there is practically nothing going on, have become an entire modern symbol of anti-Japanese resistance? Well, to understand this whole thing, I think we have to take a little look back at some history. The Dokdo Islets are also known internationally as Liancourt Rocks, or Takashima in Japan. They are mentioned in ancient writings that mention that the islands belonged to Korea as early as 512, during the time of the Korean Silla Kingdom. In 1905, during the Russo-Japanese War, the Empire of Japan occupied them, and shortly after, in 1910, they were annexed like the rest of the Korean peninsula as the Japanese Empire's own territory. That is why, for Koreans, Dokdo symbolizes the first territory to fall victim to the Japanese occupation of 1910, and for them, it is part of the territories colonized during that time. The fact is that, once again, after the fall of the Japanese Empire in 1945, these islets were once again in Korean hands, or at least, that is what the Koreans believed. However, for the Japanese, they were no more than terra nullius, or no man's land, and therefore, they could still claim them. But didn't the decolonization of Korea and the dissolution of the Japanese Empire determine Dokdo's future? Well, look at what Article 2A of the Treaty of San Francisco said.
Japan, recognizing the independence of Korea, renounces all right, title and claim to Korea, including the islands of Kelpart, Port Hamilton, and Daguelet, Article 2A of the Treaty of San Francisco.
As I'm sure you've noticed, the Liancourt Rocks are not expressly mentioned in the treaty, and that's the legal vacuum that Japan uses to continue to claim the islets. For this reason, the arguments to defend Korean sovereignty of these islands basically revolve around historical, geographical, and even geological debates. Yes, geological ones. Koreans consider that they are part of the continental platform of the South Korean island of Ulleungdo, which is 94 kilometers away, while the closest Japanese islands, the Oki Islands, are 157 kilometers from Dokdo. The fact is, as we saw with the Senkaku Islands, the diplomatic conflict over Dokdo is surprisingly more alive than ever, in part because of things like this.
156-year-old map may reignite Japan-South Korea island dispute, DW.
On that 1861 map, Dokdo was drawn as part of the Kingdom of Korea. The map had been hidden until 2017, as part of the collection of a Japanese individual. Yes, I know, ironically Japanese, who acquired it in 1932. Before that, it was in a library in Pyongyang. Another document of Japan's Great Council of State, dated 1877, said that Dokdo had no relationship with Japan. However, friends, there are Korean maps for all tastes where Dokdo is drawn as Korean territory, and other Japanese maps that include it as a part of the Shimane Prefecture. All this has led to a degree of myth-making about who should control the islets, and in Japan, at least in Shimane Prefecture, they take it quite seriously. In fact, the prefectural government declared February 22nd as Takashima Day, and every year there are acts and events claiming sovereignty over Dokdo, a propaganda campaign that is not only Japanese, but also South Korean. Although it may seem strange to us, both governments spend millions of dollars every year to promote Dokdo sovereignty, have institutional websites of their respective foreign ministries trying to explain the whole thing, and even put ads on the streets or in the subway. Yes, it may seem that in this part of the world, they're kinda touchy. And what can I say? You're right. Conflicts aside, when it comes down to it, this is really the desire to fight. So, who controls these islets today? Well, right now, it's South Korea. This country maintains a rotating military contingent of 39 troops that is permanently deployed on these islands and even has residents who are elderly and may have to leave the island very soon to gain access to medical treatment. The most curious thing of all is that the soldiers policing Dokdo are usually young men from the compulsory military service who chose this place because they imagine that they won't have to do much there. And they're right, because there's literally nothing to do. Literally. Because on these islands, there is only one small pier, a guard post, a lighthouse, post box, and a couple of walking paths. Nothing else. Meanwhile, Japan has been proposing to submit this dispute to the decision of the International Court of Justice in The Hague for years, something that Seoul rejects, because for them, that would be like conceding that there are doubts about the sovereignty of a territory that, in their view, was occupied by force as part of the former Japanese colonization. Now, at this point, many of you are probably asking yourselves, but what on earth does Dokdo have that would arouse so much interest from both countries? What justifies the deployment of 39 soldiers, or that the ministries of both countries should waste a single minute on this story? Well, friends, this is where it becomes interesting. Some reports speak of a huge gas deposit in the region of Ulleungdo and Dokdo, which could supply all of South Korea's gas needs for a period of between 30 and 100 years. And don't forget that South Korea is a major consumer of natural gas. By the way, as a side note, did you know that Dokdo was once bombed? And no, the antagonist was not Japan, but the United States. In 1948, the US Army carried out some aerial missile practice exercises here, which ended very, very badly. It turns out that just at the time of the exercises, there were about 80 South Korean fishing boats collecting seaweed. The event ended with 16 Koreans dead and the reputation of the US Army at rock bottom. But friends, we can't finish this video without telling you about the curious case of Okinotorishima, an island that, well, actually isn't even an island. Listen up.
The submersible disputes.
Let's see what you think if I told you that Japan is devoting substantial diplomatic efforts to reclaim some islets, some rocks, in the middle of the Philippine Sea that barely stand 20 centimeters above sea level, and that have a total land area of barely 0.008 kilometers squared. What? What do you make of that? We are talking about Okinotorishima, a coral reef administered by Japan that is barely visible in the middle of the sea, with 2 rocks that have been built up with concrete to prevent them from becoming submerged with the high tide. This is verging on the absolutely absurd. To all appearances, it seems like a desperate attempt to preserve some rocks that would most likely have disappeared under the sea if it wasn't for the concrete. The question is, why? What makes someone pour piles of concrete on some rocks in the middle of the sea? Well, there is actually an explanation for all this. What Japan wants here is an exclusive economic area recognition, which stretches about 200 nautical miles or about 370 kilometers around these rocks. That's the same granted to the coastal zones of any continental country or that of populated and consolidated islands. Japan's intention in this case is to overlap this area with China's exclusive economic zone in order to steal a piece of this cake from them, if the Chinese were to leave, of course. Of course, for things like this, where we are talking about uninhabited islands, international legislation only recognises 12 nautical miles, or 22 kilometers, of exclusive economic zone. In these exclusive economic zones, the respective states have the exclusive right to manage and extract the resources, for example, minerals or fish, they consider appropriate, that is, to use the area as they wish. In fact, exclusive economic zones have a lot to do with all the disputes that we've seen in this video. Normally, countries try to make their exclusive economic zone as large as possible. But in the case of Okinotorishima, it's, I don't know how to describe it, dreaming beyond your means. Yet something very similar is happening with Eodo. Eodo, also called Socotra Rock, is a submerged rock 4.6 meters below the surface that lies between China and Korea, and is administered de facto by South Korea. With the intention of granting Korea exclusive economic zone rights over this rock, the government built an ocean research platform in 2003, attached to the submerged rock itself, where the South Korean flag, marking its ownership, is clearly visible. The subject of Eodo might seem to be one of the most surrealistic in this video, because the rock does not even appear above the sea. But it is just one more example of how the 3 great countries of East Asia, China, South Korea, and Japan, tried to scratch out areas of influence by any means possible. And if there just so happens to be mineral resources, gas, or good fishing grounds, as seems to be the case here, then all the better. Anyway, friends, these are the main territorial disputes in the waters of the seas surrounding Japan. And although they may seem ridiculous conflicts to many of us, the fact is that they stoke diplomatic fires that sometimes see the tension pushed to the extreme, with military deployments, threats of sanctions, and the risk that for any step out of line, things could easily kick off and get out of hand, all in the name of national pride, while expanding their exclusive economic zones in the process. Anyway, I hope that now, when you hear about these controversies, you have a better understanding of what they mean. So, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon, and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.